4 Gupta Age, Post-Gupta Period. 1 Unit 4 Gupta Age, Post-Gupta Period and Arrival of Islam Structure 4.0 Introduction 4.1 Unit Objectives 4.2 The Concept of the Golden Age 4.3 Pan-Hinduism and the Theory of Greater India 4. 4 Feudalism 45 Asiatic Mode of Production 4.6 Coming of Islam 461 Debate over Islamization 462 Synthesis of Cultures 463 Theocracy and the Indian State 4.7 Summary 4. 8 Key Terms 49 Answers to Check Your Progress 4.10 Questions and Exercises 4.11 Further Reading Introduction By the middle of the AD 4th century, India entered upon its classical age. A new empire that of the Guptas, emerged in Magadha, the ancient homeland of the Mauryan Empire. The influx of alien peoples, the Greeks, Shakas and Kushans, was contained and they were assimilated into the evolving structure of Indian large society. The two basic elements of India's cultural unity, Hinduism and Sanskrit, were now firmly established and later ages were to provide their own variations on these fundamental themes. It was the age when the Indian variant of feudalism became the basic pattern of the organization of power, a pattern that was to survive for centuries through dynastic revolutions and wars of attrition. Until AD 711, India had faced many invasions, but no significant challenges on both military and cultural level. The Persians and Greeks had confronted India with highly developed civilizations, but also had reached the limits of their expansion by the time they arrived there. The different nomadic peoples who entered India between the 2nd century BC and AD 8th century may have been more powerful military threats, but their cultures were thoroughly absorbed by India. However, in AD 712, India faced for the first time vital people with a culture and religion both as sophisticated and powerful as its own, i.e., Islam. The victory of 4-0 Arabs in that battle also led to the triumph of Islam over Buddhism as the prevailing religion in Central Asia. Consequently, although India continued to face a succession of invaders from the north, all those invaders had Islam as the common defining element of their cultures, a religion that in its own way was as appealing as Hinduism. The period under consideration has been debated and a rich historiography is available for the study of this period. 4.1 Unit Objectives. After going through this unit, you will be able to understand the concept of Golden Age of the Guptas, examine Pan-Hinduism and the theory of Greater India, analyze feudalism in India, elucidate Asiatic mode of production, describe the advent of Islam in India and its impact. 4. 2. The concept of the Golden Age, the Gupta Age, AD 320-550 inches, has been a subject of unending debate in academic circles between the nationalist and Marxist historians with diametrically opposite views of this classical period which saw perfection as the keyword in all its activities. The colonial or imperial historians like V.A. Smith dubbed ancient India as a dark age, which enabled the British to divide and rule India. The nationalists in their reactions against an unfair portrayal of ancient India borrowed the periodization of Indian history. Ancient India is equivalent to Hindu India. Medieval India is equivalent to Muslim India and British India is equivalent to British India and advent of Christianity. Nationalist historians like R.C. Mazumdar, K.K. Datta, H. C. Ray Chaudhuri exaggerated the achievements of ancient India and coined the term Golden Age for the Gupta period. They considered this as a dynamic period in ancient Indian history, which lasted for more than 2 centuries, and left a powerful impact on India's cultural heritage to can the tag of Golden Age. Some scholars have described it as Augustan Age. Some others have compared it with the Periclean Age of Greece. Others define it as the Classical Age and the majority of them agree with the view that it was the Golden Age of ancient India. The Gupta Age began AD 320 under Chandragupta I, who raised his stature by establishing matrimonial relations with the well-established political clan of Lichavis. His policy aided his son and successor, Samudragupta's expansion of the Patalipatra-based kingdom into an empire. Samudragupta's reign saw considerable military expansion. His gold coins refer to him as Pirakrama, the all-conquering one, but was soon followed by peaceful conditions in northern India after his all-conquering Ashwamedha Yajna ended with an all-round victory. It is said that Samudragupta was succeeded by his eldest son, Ramagupta, shortly toppled by his younger brother, Chandragupta I due to competence. It was under this ruler whose coins hail him as Vikramaditya the Shining Sun that the Gupta Empire expanded into western India by the conquest of Malwa and Gujarat from the last of the Shakas. Chandragupta II's accomplishments led to his identification with the legendary Vikramaditya, or at last seen as the inspiration for the tales of the mythical brave king who challenges the unknown. He also established peace with his Deccan contemporaries, the Vikatikas, by marrying his daughter, Prabhavati, to Rudrasena II, the Vikataka king. This indirect expansion also guaranteed external peace for the Gupta dynasty. Chandragupta I's reign, thus, saw the construction of the Iron Pillar as a lofty standard to Lord Vishnu. The ascendancy of Kalidas, a contemporary Sanskrit poet who was conferred the title of Indian Shakespeare. Furthermore, according to Chinese pilgrim, Fa-Hin, Patalipatra was in fact Brahmanical practices with magnificent stupas and an annual Buddhist festival, though the emperor proclaims himself as Paramabhagavata, the leading devotee Vishnu and his coins. This account demolishes another Marxist claim of conflict between Buddhism and Brahmanism. Fa-Hin does continue to describe the caste-based hierarchy prevalent in the period in which the Chandalas were the lowest in Acha. Thus, the Gupta Age presents us a mixed picture of excellence with rise of caste-abused hierarchical divisions. The latter becomes more severe especially when viewed from modern perceptions, which need not have been the case, as in practice. Harmony seemed to dominate the scenario on the ground as apparent by Fa-Hin's unbiased accounts of the period when gold literally flowed through the land. Thus, nationalist historians have expounded the theory of the Golden Age to suggest that the Gupta period was a time in history when virtually every aspect of life reached its zenith. In their view, products in arts, literature and philosophy became a measure of cultural achievement of any period. Sanskrit sources acquired prime importance. They declined the tendency of tracing all great achievements of humans to Greek culture. The Gupta period was selected mainly because of notable literary works in Sanskrit and the high quality of art, which coincided with what was viewed as a Brahmanical renaissance. The initial spread of Brahmanical culture as high culture on an extraordinary scale was described as the Golden Period. The remote past had an advantage, for it allowed greater choice of imagination in recreating the past. Now that historians are commenting on all aspects of society, the concept of a uniformly golden age that includes an entire society has been questioned in the post-independence period. The Marxist historians, while criticizing institutionalist historiography, postulated the theory of Indian feudalism from the Gupta period onwards. The Marxist historians R.S. Sharma, B.N.S. Yadava, D.N. Jha and others forwarded the view that the Guptas began with the regular practice of giving land grants to the Brahmins with fiscal privileges, and the post-Gupta rulers in addition gave away the administrative and judicial rights together with fiscal rights initially to Brahmins' temples and onto officials and even to merchants. Thus, the Guptas and their successors including Harsha brought about a feudal political structure in which landed intermediaries ruled rural society and politically fragmented and decentralized India. Land grants brought feudal practices in economy as trade and urbanization declined in the post-Gupta period and exploited peasantry with increasing burden of taxes. Obnoxious practices such as tantricism marked the cultural and religious features of Indian feudalism. As a critique of Indian feudalism, B.D. Chattopadhyaya and Herman Kulk advocated the processualist model integrative model of state formation for the study of the post-Gupta India or early medieval India. They argued that land grants to Brahmins and temples, instead of decentralization of the political authority of bigger and smaller states, legitimized the exercise of royal authority in the countryside and, hence, integrated the territorial units and chiefs into the emerging local, subregional and regional state. As Professor B. P. Sahu, while giving his presidential address to the Ancient Indian section of the Indian History Congress, refers to the integrative processual model of studying states in the Gupta and post-Gupta periods. Dr. Nandini Sinha Kappa, Indian historian, has confirmed the integrative forces in the formation of two near-contemporary states to the Guptas, the Vakataka state in Vidarbha and the Maitraka in Gujarat, instead of disintegration. The integrative model highlights integrative forces in ancient Indian history. The Marxist historians have thus derided the period's achievements in art, literature, architecture and metallurgy as it benefited only the upper caste elite and thus, not worthy of the epithet of a golden age. The depiction of a golden age reflects the life of the wealthy and their activities alone portray such an age. In Indian history, there are at least three epochs when artistic and literary expression achieved remarkable levels: the post-Mauryan and Gupta period, the Cholas and the Mughals. The forerunner to the culture of the Gupta period was not restricted to northern India, since the Deccan shows outstanding evolution of cultures. The classicism of the Gupta period is not a novelty stemming out from Gupta rule but the culmination of a process that commenced earlier. The pre-Gupta period witnessed new artistic forms in North India, such as those related to Buddhism and which also found parallels in other religious sects, with the writing of texts on technical subjects and creative literature of various types. The description of the Gupta period as one of classicism is relatively correct as far as the upper classes are concerned. They led a good life according to the descriptions in their literature and representations in their art. The more precise, literal evidence that comes from archaeology suggests a less glowing lifestyle for the majority of the people. Significantly, excavated sites suggest that the average standard of living may have been higher in the preceding period. Marxist historians also highlighted the inequities of the period caused by the rise of caste-based hierarchy in favor of the twice-born Brahmins and Kshatriyas. According to D. N. Jha, distinctions on the basis of caste and caste rigidity became more pronounced than ever before. Law and justice show a clear continuation of the fourfold division of the society into the Vama system, Chattopadhyaya bias in favor of the higher castes. The conventional historiography projected Terma in the Gupta and post-Gupta period. However, R.C. Hazra mentions that Kati Purana's present descriptions of Kali Yuga in terms of foreign invasions, civility, social tension, struggle and teaching of hedonistic sects. However, modem historians like R. S. Sharma attribute the origin of Kali Yuga to mixing of castes, Lumna Sankara, and the rise of Shudras in the beginning of the 4th century. Therefore, it was a period of social crises. It was an age of enmity between Brahmins and Shudras, Vaishyas declining to perform yajnas on tax-burdened population, law and order problem, thefts, unsecured family and property, increasing materialism, decreasing religion's rituals and sovereignty of Mlechha, low caste, kings. The inscriptions of the Vakatikas of Vidarbha and Pallavas of Kanchipuram are cited to show that they acted together against Kali Yuga. However, in his description of India, Farheen tells us the people were generally happy. No doubt, the upper strata of the society were happy and prosperous, and lived in comfort and case, as is evident from the contemporary art and literature. However, this was hardly true for the lower orders. Farheen speaks of the condition of the Chandals. The untouchable class in totality came to be degraded further in the social scale. Social tensions continued, but religion was used as a tool for keeping the very divided society intact. All the periods of history have been golden for the upper classes and none for the masses. The status of women declined because of the early marriages. Moreover, sati came to be practiced in those days. The earliest historical evidence for this practice dates from AD 510, when it was commemorated in an inscription at Erin in Madhya Pradesh. Most of the legal codes of the day reiterate the Brahmin viewpoint in all matters including the status of women. Thus, the truly golden age of the people does not lie in the past, but in the future. 3. Pan-Hinduism and the theory of Greater India. The nationalist historians of India played a very important role in the interpretation of ancient Indian history. Since they wrote in conscious opposition to the earlier writing, they forced historians to take a fresh look at the sources. They raised controversies and triggered a debate. Thus, interpretation of Indian history was no longer based on a monolithic ideology. Apart from this, the study of Indian past began to have relevance for the present. And historical writing had to be more than merely a collection of facts. Although most of the historical writing was still restricted to the dynastic history, the debate on ancient cultural and political life required the study of social and economic history. There was a tendency to regard the ancient period of Indian history as one of considerable prosperity and general contentment. J.S. Mill's periodization of history was accepted without much questioning, and a very sharp distinction was drawn between the Hindu ancient and the Muslim medieval periods. This distinction was highlighted by the rather arbitrary association of the most acceptable achievements of the Indian past with Hindu culture. Nationalism was substituted by a form of militant Hinduism, and the communal atmosphere in Indian politics in 3rd and 4th decade of the 20th century tended to spoil the study of ancient and medieval history. It was maintained that Hinduism in its Sanskritic form was the fundamental culture of India, and other forces were in a sense an intrusion. The identification of ancient India with Hindu culture became so prominent that even the followers of Buddhism were viewed with some suspicion. Earlier efforts to prove the indigenous origin of all things Indian was emphasized, a trend which continued to be supported by many historians to this day. It was considered that the dynamics of many Asian cultures, especially those of Southeast Asia, arose from Hindu culture, and the theory of Greater India derived nourishment from Pan-Hinduism. C. Majumdar asserted that the Hindu colonists brought the whole framework of their culture and civilization and it was transplanted into entirely of people who had not yet emerged from their barbarianism. India's past was looked with great pride as expressed in Foling as Tea art of Java and Kambuja was no doubt derived from India and fostered by the Indian rulers of these colonies. This type of interpretation of history inspired by Hindu nationalism remains a significant school of thought in historical Riti and GS of present team as the use of Greater India with respect to Indian cultural sphere was made popular by a group of Bengali scholars in the 1920s who were all members of the Calcutta-based Greater India Society. Early leaders of the movement comprised the historian R. C. Majumdar, 1888–1980, the philologist Suniti Kumar Chatterjee, 1890–1977, and P. C. Bagchi, 1898–1956, and the historians Fanindranath Bose and Kalidas Nag, 1891–1966. Some of their formulations were inspired by simultaneous excavations by French archaeologists in Ankara and by the works of French Indologist Sylvain Levi. The term Greater India is most commonly used to include the historical and geographic extent of all political units of the Indian subcontinent, and the regions which are culturally related to India or received significant Indian cultural influence. These countries have to an extent been transformed by the acceptance and introduction of cultural and institutional elements of India. As a consequence of Asia's expanding land and maritime trade since 500 BC, there had been long drawn-out socio-economic and cultural stimulation and diffusion of Hindu and Buddhist beliefs in the region's cosmology, particularly in Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka. However, transmission of ideas in Central Asia was mainly of religious nature. By the early centuries of the Common Era, a majority of the principalities of Southeast Asia had effectively absorbed defining features of Hindu culture, religion and administration. The concept of divine god kingship was introduced. Sanskrit and other Indian epigraphic systems were declared official. Like those of Indian Pallava dynasty and Chalukya dynasty, these Indianized kingdoms, a term coined by French archaeologist Georges Cordes in his book, Histoire ancienne des États Hindaouisés d'Extrême Orient, the Indianized states of Southeast Asia, were distinguished by surprising resilience, political integrity and administrative stability. As far as the north is concerned, Indian religious ideas were accepted in the cosmology of Himalayan people, most intensely in Tibet and Bhutan. Buddhist monasticism became rampant in Afghanistan, Uzbekistan and other parts of Central Asia, and Buddhist texts and ideas were readily accepted in China and Japan in the Far East. Indian culture overlaps with Greater Persia via the Hindu Kush and the Pamir Mountains in the west. However, the Indian nationalists, like Jawaharlal Nehru and Rabindranath Tagore, although accepted the idealization of India as a benevolent world civilizer and fond of global enlightenment, stayed away from explicit Greater India formulations. Apart from this, some scholars have seen the Hindu-Buddhist acculturation in ancient Southeast Asia as a single cultural process in which Southeast Asia was the matrix and South Asia the mediatrix. In the field of art history, particularly in American writings, the term continued to exist due to the influence of art theorist Ananda Kumaraswamy. His view of pan-Indian art history was influenced by the Calcutta cultural nationalists. As reported by some accounts, Greater India comprised of lands including Burma, Philippines, Java, Cambodia, Bali, and the former Champa and Funan polities of present-day Vietnam, in which Indian and Hindu culture left an imprint in the form of monuments, inscriptions and other traces of the historic Indianizing process. According to some other accounts, numerous Pacific societies and most of the Buddhist world including Ceylon, Tibet, Central Asia, and even Japan were held to fall within this web of Indianizing culture colonies. This particular usage meaning cultural sphere of influence of India was put forward by the Greater India Society, formed by a group of Bengali scholars before the 1920s. The term Greater India was used in historical writing in India into the 1970s. Check your progress. 1. Who was the first ruler of the Gupta dynasty? 2. Who developed the term Indianized kingdoms? 3. Define the term Greater India. The South. 4.4 Feudalism. In recent years, the study of feudalism in the Indian context has attracted due attention of scholars. The first assimilation of feudalism in the Indian context occurred at the hands of Col James Todd, who wrote the famous book Amal's und Antiquities of Rajasthan for Todd. As for most European historians of his time in Europe, lord-vassal relationship constituted the core of feudalism. In medieval Europe, the lord looked after the security and subsistence of his vassals and they in turn provided military and other services to the lord. A sense of loyalty also tied the vassal to the lord in perpetuity. Todd found the institution and the pattern replicated in the Rajasthan of H's day in good Mesared term feudalism continued to figure intermittently in Indian history, often with the vague meaning attached to it. It was with the increasing Marxist influence on Indian history writing between the mid-1950s and the mid-60s that the term came to be disassociated from its moorings in lord-vassal relationship and attained an economic meaning, or rather meaning in the context of the evolution of Indian class structure. One of the major urgency of the formulation of an Indian feudalism was, ironically, the dissatisfaction of Marxist historians with Manson's placement of pre-colonial Indian history in the category of the Asiatic mode of production, despite the fact that Marx had created this category himself. Much of the substance that had gone into its making was usual among Western thinkers of the 18th and the 19th centuries. Marx had perceived the Asiatic mode of production as an exception to the general dynamic of history through the medium of class struggle. In Asia, he, together with many other thinkers, assumed that there were no classes because all property belonged either to the king or to the community, hence, there was no class struggle and no change over time. He shared this idea of themation with Chemine thinkers James Mill, Montesquieu, Friedrich Hodge and others. In their opinion, real dynamism came mainly with the establishment of colonial regimes which brought concepts and ideas of change from Europe to the Orient. Indian Marxist historians of the 1950s and 60s expressed their dissatisfaction with the idea of the Asian mode of production. Curly on some of them instead adapted the concept of feudalism and applied it to India. However, Ifan Habib, the leading Manus historian of the period, stayed aloof from Indian feudalism, even as he strongly criticized the Asiatic mode of product. I&D Kasambi accepted the category of feudalism as relevant for understanding medieval India and gave it a place in the context of socio-economic history. He noted that some of the important features of European feudalism, like the manorial system, domain farming and serfdom, were not prevalent in India. In his opinion, it was due to the non-existence of the slave made of production in the past. In his landmark book, An Introduction to the Study of Indian Puri, published in 1956, Le concepted to stages in the development Indian feudalism from above and from below. From above, the king remained paramount and the feudal structure was created by the state granting land and rights to officials and Brahmins. In feudalism from below, Many individuals and small groups rose from the village levels of power to become landlords and vassals of the kings to wield armed power over the local population, consequence of state action, i.e., from above. He essentially emulated the rise, and Professor R. Sharma undertook comprehensive study of feudalism in India in his book, Indian Feudalism, published in 1965, and in various articles. However, instead, he envisioned the rise of feudalism in Indian history entirely as the decline of feudalism in Europe given by a Belgian historian, Henry Pirenne. According to R.S. Sharma, there was a decline in long-distance trade, commodity production, and monetization in the post-Gupta period. Due to decline in the quantity of cash the services were required to be paid in kind, with the increase in the number of undergrants to the state officials in lieu of salary and charity or ritual offering to the Brahmas. The process of feudalization started by strengthening the local authorities. This process got impetus with the decline of urbanization and the growth of localized and self-contained economies. Almost all the characteristics of West European feudalism, such as serfdom, manor, feudalization of crafts and commerce, self-sufficient economic units, decline of towns and decline of long-distance trade, was said to be present in India. The most vital aspects of feudalism in India were the great increase in the number of intermediaries and subjection of peasantry to the landlords. The increasing subjection of peasants to the intermediaries reduced them to the level of serfs, their counterparts in medieval Europe. As a consequence, peasants' mobility was restricted and they were subjected to intensive forced labor. Indian feudalism declined in a similar manner as in West Europe. Rise of towns, revival of long-distance trade, escape of peasants, and the increase of monetization in economy were regarded as the main factors responsible for the decline of feudalism in India. One element that was missing in the above picture was the Indian counterpart of the Arab invasion of Europe. However, Professor B.N.S. Yadav, another famous supporter of Indian feudalism thesis, drew attention to the invasions of Hunas in India, which almost coincided with the beginning of the rise of feudalism in India. As a consequence of the exploitative feudal system in Europe, there were massive rebellions of peasants in Europe. R.S. Sharma looked for evidence of similar uprising in India but found only one example of Kavatis. They were boatmen of eastern Bengal and part-time cultivators who revolted in the 19th century. The above-mentioned feudalism thesis received full support of B.N.S. Yadav and N.J. Acclaimed South Indian historians like M.G.S. Narayanan and Nobuo Kirashima also stood firmly by this thesis. However, there was criticism too in some extremely learned quarters, the most eminent critic being D.C. Surka. He went to the extent of asserting that the early medieval India never witnessed the growth of feudal institutions. Instead, the system that existed in the contemporary society can be called as landlordism. In his book, Studies in the Development of Capitalism, published in 1946, Marxist economist Maurice Dobb first seriously questioned the Pirenian opposition between trade and feudalism, and following Engels' insights, drew attention to the fact that the revival of trade in Eastern Europe had brought about the second Erdem, i.e., feudalism. He put forward the view that feudalism did not decline even in Western Europe due to the revival of trade but due to the flight of the peasants to cities due to overexploitation at the hands of lords in the villages. This thesis triggered an international debate in the early 1950s among Marxist economizers and historians. The debate was chiefly concerned with the question whether feudalism and trade were mutually incompatible. Harbans Mathis, another Marxist historian and the author of Was There Feudalism in Indian History, questions the idea of Indian feudalism at many levels. He opened that there is no single universally accepted definition of feudalism is because capitalism and not feudalism was not a world system. Capitalism was the first world system. Before capitalism, all societies possessed their own peculiarities. The feudalism was non-universal, specific form of socio-economy organization specific to time and region. Mukherjee defines feudalism as the structured dependence of the entire peasantry on the lords in Europe. The relationship between long-distance trade and the growth and decline of feudalism is under in India. It is uncertain that there was significant decline of trade and towns in the early medieval period, while feudalism in Europe developed and declined as a result of the changes at the base of society. In India, the reason for the emergence of feudalism is seen as the land grants from above. It is hard to believe that such complex social structures can be established by means of administrative and legal procedures. Mukherjee also opines that despite the fact that the exploitation of peasantry might have increased, there is lack of evidence to justify that there was any extraneous control over the peasants' process of production. Therefore, forced labor in India remained more or less an incidental manifestation of the ruling class political and administrative power rather than a part of the process of production. Accessibility of surplus and increased soil fertility, and lower subsistence level of the Indian peasantry worked against their dependence on the lords. He finally concludes that the basically free peasant form of agricultural production steadily evolving from post-Mauryan times, thus, characterized the agrarian economy of ancient and medieval India. So in these circumstances there was no possibility of a feudal mode of production in India's Mukherjee's views triggered vigorous debate among the Marxist and some non-Marxist researchers in this field. S. Sharma opined that although feudalism was not a universal system like tribalism or capitalism, it was no doubt more than the slave system. He questioned the concept of peasants' rights revalent or the band. There were multiple and hierarchical rights of the land with their having inferior knights. Forced labor was also very common in India. He emphasized that there was feudalism during the early medieval India which was actorized by a class of landlords and by a class of subject peasantry. The two being in a primarily agrarian economy characterized by decline of trade and another noted historian, Ifan Habib, argues that although the social form of her defines a particular mode of production, it cannot be regarded as the sole nominant. Therefore, even though Waggo labor is the common form of labor, wipers and production may be found in several social formations. As a result, tunidion and by scarcity of coins were crucial elements should be taken into account, which is the form in which the surplus taken from the producer is distributed. Although Habib is uncertain, Matthias' views regarding the existence of an independent peasantry and relative ability in India's social and economic history. N.J. accepts the notion of feudalism, but he had criticized R. Sharma for giving undue importance on the absence of long-distance external trade as the source of the rise of feudalism in India. He advanced a view that the argument given by B.N.S. Yadav and R.S. Sharma, that there was a deep social crisis, elected in the description of the Kali Age in many epic and Puranic passages, acting as a prelude to feudalization, carried more weight because it traces the mess of feudal formation and internal social dynamics without discording the decline in emotional trade as a causative factor. He criticizes Mukherjee's argument about the fro-peasantry and advanced a view that there is ample evidence of the subjection of peasantry to the landlords in the post-Gupta period. The growth of intermediaries, graded land rights, and other economic dimensions of feudalism actually shaped the nature of state in Kali medieval India. 2 B.D. Chattopadhyaya took an feudalism stance. He questioned the idea of decline in trade and urbanization in the post-Gupta period. He argues that trade had flourished in India long before the deadline set by feudalists for its revival. He also refutes the idea of drastic reduction of metal currency, since there was no perceivable crisis. He finds it extraordinary that the pre-feudal polity would decide to relinquish its sources of revenue and its powers. Ranabir Chakravarti in his two books, Trade in Early India, 2001, and Trade and Traders in Early Indian Society, 2002, has shown enough evidence of flourishing trade in the post-Gupta period. The argument of scarcity of coins fundamental to the formulation of Indian feudalism has also been put under severe strain by researchers of B.D. Gattopadhyaya and B. Mukherjee. John S. Dale too in his book, Living Wow Silver, 1990, seriously undermined the postulation of the scarcity of Y. Another point to be noted is that metals like gold, silver or copper are not the only forms of money in medieval societies. Mark Bloch had revealed that in medieval Europe, almost anything could perform the functions of a medium of exchange, i.c. money, a certain measure of a certain kind of spice, a piece of cloth of a certain quality, a measure of a particular grain, no matter what. In India also the tradition of kauris as a medium of exchange has attracted the attention of historians, and the fact that procuring kauris actually involved long-distance trade for the kauri shells were obtained from the faraway Maldives highlights in importance 4.5 Asiatic mode of production. It was a concept developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. In the writings of Karl Marx, stages of social history are distinguished not by what human beings produce but by how, or by what means they produce the material goods for subsistence. Thus, historical periods are founded and differentiated on the basis of the modes of material production. For production, people enter into definite relations with one another. Production occurs within these social relations. Thus, the forces of production shape the relations of production, and the two together define the mode of production. That is the general economic frame or particular manner in which people produce and distribute the means for livelihood. Hence, the successive modes of production are the basic element of a methodical description of history. Why more than one mode of production may exist within any particular society at a given point in time, but in all forms of society there is one specific kind of production which assigns rank and influence to all the others. The notion of Asiatic mode of production refers to a specific original mode of production which is different from the ancient slave mode of production or the feudal mode of production. In the 20th century Marxist politics and social sciences, the concept of Asiatic mode of production was highly debatable over the question as to how to apply the concept of mode of production to non-Western societies. The concept incorporates several elements drawn from the widely prevalent European image of Asia as the direct opposite of Europe. In this image, Europe was supposed to have been on a successful march of progress due to rationality, science and technology. On the other hand, Asia was perceived as still static. Lacking in history, Marx believed that this changelessness in Asia was due to the absence of private property. He believed that despotism and stagnancy were the basic features of Asiatic mode of production. In the absence of private property, absence of intermediary groups between kings and peasants, and absence of classes, dialectical change was impossible as there could be no class conflicts. Absence of commercial centers and cities engaged in production for a market meant economic change was impossible. Marxist theorists also relied on the Asiatic mode of production to argue for revolutionary strategies in societies caused to experience colonial and domination. The concept status within Marx's own work is vague. The young man's references to Asian societies are influenced by a political tradition where the Asian continent is characterized by socio-economic stagnation and local despotism. Marx in his book, German Ideology, published in 1845, makes mention of the Asian mode of production. However, his book, Free of 1847, talk about India as a society where village-based production with common land property. His view of Asia became more systematic. 1850, and he outlined a specific mode of production for this continent. In 151, he wrote a number of articles for the New York Daily Tribune which assist in detail with the Indian case and to a lesser degree with China. The Asiatic mode of production meant the non-existence of private ownership funds, autonomous village communities, and a despotic centralized state in charge of public works. To meet the expenses of public infrastructure, the state adopts coercive measures and controls the armed forces in order to extract economic surplus produced by local communities in the form of tributes and collective work. Once the surplus is extracted, local communities remain comparatively independent in their self-sustaining economies. The Asiatic mode of production almost vanished from Marx's writings after the first volume of his book, Das Kapital, 1867. Engels' analysis of pre-capitalist societies in the book, The Origins of Feudality, Private Property, and the State, 1884, did not mention it. In the early 8th century, socialist reformers of the Second International took the concept as a symbol for backwardness of Asia. They saw a force of development and modernization in colonialism. After the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, fervent arguments on the Asiatic mode of production cropped up again. In fact, Lenin had enigmatized the Asiatism of Tsarist Russia. However, the Stalinist Third Humational Comintern refuted the Asiatic mode of production in 1921 when in colonial societies it decided to support alliances between the proletariat and monolist bourgeoisies. Against imperialism and indigenous ruling class, says the significant positions of Leon Trotsky and Evgeny Varga nevertheless hinted at the Asiatic mode of production in proposing anti-colonial alliances of workers and peasants against both foreign imperialism and local bourgeoisie. The concept was finally obliterated from orthodox Marxism after 1930, as still in default a rigid, mechanical succession of modes of production. The Asiatic mode of production re-emerged in Marxist historiography and anthropology during the 1980s in the context of intensified anti-colonial and anti-imperialist resistance. Maurice Godelier, French anthropologist, emphasized that this mode of production remained central throughout the works of Marx and Engels. Jean Chesnoux, French historian, did not restrict the concept's validity to Asia, but extended it to her entire traditional societies. Simultaneously, these authors argue for a dynamic viewpoint to depart from the Eurocentric bias of orthodox Marxism, which saw pro-capitalist and non-Western societies as stagnant and undeveloped. The Asiatic mode of production also received criticism in Marxist debates. Historians Barry Hindis and Paul Hurst declined to consider it as a mode of production because it presumes the state rather than explaining it through the analysis of social relations. Maxime Rodinson, French Marxist historian, sociologist and Orientalist, regarded it as a blunt and simplified way to encase highly complex societies. Claude Millesaux, leading French social anthropologist, Noted the concept's excessive generalization as it intermingles varied social formations that share a tributary extraction of surplus. Lastly, post-colonial studies have discarded the Asiatic mode of production concept, considering it as a reflex of the cultural stereotypes that supported European imperial expansion. Check your progress for. What were the main factors responsible for the decline of feudalism in India? 5. Who developed the concept of Asiatic mode of production? 6. What were the significant features of Asiatic mode of production as per man? 4. 6. Coming of Islam. The culture of Islam was quite different from the culture of various invaders who came to India during the course of its long history. The real culture of Islam was represented by the Muslim empires of Baghdad, Cairo and Cordoba. The Turks and the Afghans brought the culture of Islam to India. 4. 6. 1. Debate over Islamization. Basically, there are 4 theories explaining the growth of Islam in India. However, catch is inadequate. The first of these is the immigration theory. It is not really a theory of conversion at all because it views Islamization in terms of the diffusion not of belief but of peoples. According to this theory, the majority of Indian Muslims have descended from other Muslims who had either migrated to India from the Iranian plateau or sailed across the Arabian Sea. Although some such process undoubtedly contributed to the Islamitation of those areas of South Asia that are geographically adjacent with the Iranian place or the Arabian Sea. However, this argument cannot be used to explain mass Islamization in Bengal. 3. The oldest theory of Islamization in India was the religion of the sword thesis. It emphasized the role of military force in the spread of Islam in India and other places. From the time of the Crusades, this idea received impetus during the century, the peak time of European imperial domination over Muslims. And in the context of the worldwide Islamic reform movements of the late 20th, its general character was discussed by many 19th and 20th century chastays like William Muir. He explained the rise of Islam in 7th century Arabia. His son of a militant, revived Islam gone crazy reflected, as well as old European caveans of Islam with war and sex. Colonial fears that Europe's own Muslim population might rise up in revolt and drive the Europeans back to Europe. Sir Maferal was himself a senior British official in colonial India, and also activist for the Christian missionary movement there. If colonial officials could visualize that the reason for the rise of Islam was its Mali militant character, they do not find it hard to explain its diffusion in India in anti-fashion. However, as Peter Hardy has observed, those who argued that Muslims were forcibly converted have generally failed to define their force or conversion, leaving one to presume that a society can and will change its religious identity simply because it has a sword at its neck. However, exactly how this mechanism worked has never been satisfactorily explained. Furthermore, stockets of this theory seem to have confused conversion to the Islamic religion with the expansion of Turco-Iranian rule in North India between AD 1200 and 168. A confusion probably originating in too literal a translation of Prima Y Persian counts narrating the Islamic conquest of India. The theory also does not fit in the religious geography of South Asia. If military or political force had been the reason for Islamization, then one would expect that those areas exposed most intensively and over the longest period to Muslim rule, i.e., those that were most fully exposed to the sword, would today hurt in the maximum number of Muslims. However, the case is just the opposite of those regions where the most dramatic Islamization occurred, such as Eastern Bengal or Western Punjab, lay on the borders of Indo-Muslim rule, where the word was weakest, and where brute force could have exerted the least influence. Census reports in these regions put the Muslim population somewhere between 90% of the total, while in the Muslim heartland in the Upper Gangetic in the domain of the Delhi Fort and the Taj Mahal, where Muslim dynasties had led most intensively and for the longest period of time, the Muslim population mapped from only 10 to 15%. Thus, in the subcontinent as a whole, there casts an inverse relationship between the degree of Muslim political penetration and the degree of Islamization. The principle holds true even within Bengal. In fact, it has even been proposed that far from encouraging the cause of Nishan, the proximity of Muslim political power in some cases actually hindered Isl Sharma and R. N. Srivastava to hold the view that Mughal persecution of femininely converted Mir community of Rajasthan had the effect, not of strengthening the Mu's Islamic identity, but of strengthening their resistance to a third theory to explain Islamization in India as the religion of patronage theory. According to this theory, Indians of the pre-modern period got converted to Islam with the purpose of receiving some non-religious favor from the ruling class, relief from taxes, promotion in the bureaucracy, and so forth. This theory has always been supported by the Western-trained secular social scientists that see any religion as a dependent variable of some non-religious agency, especially an assumed desire for social improvement or prestige. There are many instances which can be cited in Indian history to support this theory. Ibn Battuta, a Morocco traveller, who visited India in the 14th century, mentioned in his account the Indians presented themselves as new Kavits to the Khilji sultans, who in turn rewarded them with robes of honor according to their rank. As per the census conducted in the 19th century, many landholding families of Upper India had declared themselves Muslims in order to escape imprisonment for non-payment of revenue, or to keep ancestral lands in the family. The theory might even be extended to include groups employed by Muslim rulers that assimilated much Islamic culture even without getting converted. The acculturation of captured soldiers or slaves possibly formed another dimension of this process, even though this theory might help explain the relatively low incidence of Islamization in India's political heartland. It fails to explain the cause of large-scale conversions that occurred along the political fringoas in Punjab or Bengal. Political patronage, like the influence of the sword, would have decreased rather than increased as one moved away from the centers of that patronage. Thus, there is need of a theory that can explain the phenomenon of massive Islamization on the periphery of Muslim power and not just in the heartland, and among millions of peasant cultivators and not just among urban elites. A fourth theory called the religion of social liberation thesis was put forth by British historians and ethnographers, elaborated by many Pakistani and Bangladeshi nationals and subscribed to by a number of journalists and historians of South Asia, especially Muslims. This theory has so far been the most widely acknowledged explanation of Islamization in the subcontinent. The theory explains the evils of caste system among the Hindus that is static and rigidly discriminatory against its own lower case. It is said that for centuries, the lower order among the Hindus suffered at the hands of repressive and tyrannical high caste Hindus, especially Brahmins. When Islam arrived in the Indian subcontinent, carrying its liberating message of social equality, these same oppressed castes, which were looking forward to escape from the clutches of Brahmanical oppression and aware of a social quality hitherto denied them, and got converted to Islam in large numbers. However, the problem with this theory is that there is no evidence in its support. Moreover, it is extremely illogical fiest. By attributing present-day values to peoples of the past, it reads history backward. Before their contact with Muslims, India lower castes were abreast of some innate concept of the fundamental equality of all humankind denied to them by an oppressive Brahmanical tyranny. In fact, thinking about Islam in relation to Indian religions, pre-modern Muslim coup did not emphasize their religion's ideal of social equality as opposed to, but rather Islamic monotheism as opposed to Hindu polytheism has the frame of reference for comparing these two civilizations was theological social. Indeed, the idea that Islam promotes social equality, as opposed to Pausagunti, seems to be a recent concept. Second, although Indians did believe in the fundamental quality of mankind, if Islam had been presented to them as an ideology of social equality, there's tough evidence that Indian communities failed. Upon Islamization, tubas in the social hierarchy, fin allies with the sword and patronages the religion of social liberation theory is disproved by the geographical S1872. When the first census was conducted in India, the highest Mashanes of Muslims were found in eastern Bengal, western Punjab, West Frontier region and Balochistan. What is about those areas is tied that they were remote from the center of Muslim political power, but that their indigenous populations had not yet, at the time of their contact with Islam, be fully integrated into either the Hindu or the Buddhist social system. In Bengal, Muslim converts were drawn mainly from Rajbansi, Pod, Chandal, Cook, and the indigenous groups that had been only lightly exposed to Brahmani culture. In Punjab the same was true of the very Asjat clans that ultimately formed the scoffed Muslim community, but this is not so surprising. A later Vedic text, Badhayanadharmashtra, lecting the values of self-styled clean castes, divided the subcontinent into time-concentric circles, each one having distinct socio-cultural communities. The first of these, Iryavata, or the Aryan homeland, corresponded to the upper Ganges Jumna region of north-central India. There lived the purest heirs to Brahmanical tradition, people styling themselves Hyder and ritually clean. The second circle comprised an outer belt, Avanti, Angamagadha, Sarastra, Dolsmapathara Pavid, and Sindhu Sauvira, corresponding to Malwa, east and central Bihar, Gujarat, the Deccan and Sindh. These regions lay within the pale of HDO Aryan settlement, but they were occupied by people of mixed origin who could not enjoy the same degree of ritual purity as those of the first region. And the time-concentric circle had those outer regions inhabited by unclean tribes considered so far beyond the pale that punishments were prescribed for Thasiho visited such places. People inhabiting this third circle included the Arts of Penja, the Sauvras of southern Punjab and Sindh, Tihi Pundras of North Bengal, and the Bangas of central and east Bengal now. The religion of social liberation theory presumes the prior existence of a highly stratified Hindu social order presided over by a deep-rooted Andrist Brahmin community. If the theory was valid, the greatest frequency of conversion to Islam should logically have taken place in those areas where Snimanical social order was most deeply entrenched, i.e., the region of Iryavata. Conversely, Islam should have found its smallest number of followers in those arcas having the least exposure to Brahmanical civilization, that is, along the periphery or beyond the pale of that civilization. In the outermost of the three concentric circles mentioned in the Bandhanadhar Massacre, however, it is exactly in that outer circle Theocracy roughly coinciding with the areas included in the original, 1947, state of Pakistan, with its Kasta and western wings that the vast majority of South Asian Muslims inhabit. The modem, pre-partition distribution of South Asian Muslims, thus, point to a conclusion precisely opposite to the one predicted by the theory, namely, the less the prior exposure to Brahmanical civilization, the greater the incidence of subsequent Islamization. If the indigenous people inhabiting India's periphery had never been fully absorbed in a Brahma-ordered society in the first place, the matter of their evading a tyrannical Hindu social order cannot arise logically, just as it did not arise empirically. 4.6. 2. Synthesis of cultures. The advent of Islam in India was an epoch-making event. It exercised a profound effect on the political, religious and socio-cultural life of India. The Turkish invasions marked not only the clash of arms between the Rajputs and the Muslim invaders, but also the violent contact between the two strong religious thoughts and stream of cultural forces, from confrontation to cooperation, followed by interaction and synthesis between the two forces, constitute the various stages in the long and checkered socio-cultural history of medieval India. The period under review shows signs of slow and steady decay of ancient Hindu society, with its glorious rapid culture, giving place to the Indo-Muslim society and culture which was neither Hindus or Muslim but Indo-Muslim. The period of the Mamluk or slave dynasty, AD 1206 to 1290, was characterized by tension and serious conflict between the foreign Muslim Sis and Hindus of Indo-Gangetic Valley. Thutmose and Balban made significant contribution towards the consolidation of Turkish rule in India. However, the establishment of Khilji rule in India in AD 1290 sounded a death knell of the privileged Turkish nobility. The Khiljis, though Turks by race, belonged to the Muslim masses of India as they were all Indian Muslims. According to J.L. MCHT, it would not be wrong to say that with the establishment of the Khilji dynasty there started of Muslim rule in Delhi as compared with the Turkish rule of the earlier phase. Aladdin Khilji established Islam as a political force in the south which assumed the form of a religious and cultural force also during the period of Muhammad bin Talib. However, Faiz Shah Talib followed a policy of intolerance towards the Hindus. Nevertheless, he was a philanthropist who indulged in public welfare activities which benefited the Hindu subjects as well. Thus, 14th century, which covers the period of the reign of Khiljis and Taluk, forms a alarming point in the history of socio-cultural development of India during this period. Conflict between the two cultural forces, immigrant Islam and Naus Hinduism, was replaced first by deadlock and then mutual toleration. It gradually prepared the groundwork for interaction and exchange between them. For long, forces for bringing about synthesis between the two streams. The birth, the subsequent decline and disintegration of the Delhi Sultanate, instead of proving harmful, gave to a certain extent a momentum to the forces of cultural synthesis between the Hindus and the Muslims and increased their ordrendance. The political power of the Muslims was decentralized and shifted headquarters of the former Iktis or provinces of the Sultanate, which gave to provincial or regional Muslim states. By its thorough Indianization, Islam's socio-cultural force was firmly rooted in the soil. By the 15th century, the misconstituted part and parcel of the Indian society, which was neither Hindu Muslim but Indo-Muslim society. The foreign Islamic culture and traditions were blended together with the ancient Indian or Hindu culture, and in general, these became acceptable to the Indian society. Many of the 15th century rulers worked for the well-being of their people and enjoyed their goodwill. They eyed scholars and artists without religious discrimination and aided the socio-moral moral and material advancement of the society. The first well-known representative of the Indo-Muslim society and culture is Amir Qusat, who flourished during the Khilji and Taluk rule. Urdu, a common literary heritage of Hindus and Muslims, and a symbolic representation of cultural synthesis between Hinduism and Islam, was born during this period. The rulers of Delhi Sultanate were great architects. They established many new towns in different parts of the country which became flourishing centers of trade and commerce. Their buildings exhibit a vigorous interaction and synthesis between the foreign Islamic and ancient archaeological traditions and concepts. These are an index of a healthy and constructive exchange between the two art styles and also the communion that occurred between Hindus and Muslims during the Kali medieval age. During this time, the Bhakt and Sufi saints took up the cause of socio-religious reforms and Hindu-Muslim unity. They made an effort to bridge tegel between the two communities at the socio-cultural level. 463 Theocracy and the Indian state. The Turco-Afghan rulers of Delhi brought with them a theocratic concept of state according to which the head of the state was also considered as the religious leader of his people, the Miller, and was believed or presumed to derive his position and authority from God, by force of circumstances. The Prophet Muhammad on his hijrah emigrating from Mecca to Medina was called upon to sum the political leadership of his followers for the protection of their lives and property. Thus, the Prophet laid the groundwork of the first Muslim state in the held and assumed a double role as founder of Islam as well as temporal head of Ted, for God was said to be the true ruler of the faithful, and the Prophet ruled on behalf of the Almighty with the purpose of enforcing and spreading the Quranic law which had been declared as a divine revelation by the Prophet Muhammad. Therefore, the Muslim state, from its very beginning, was a theocracy par excellence. The ideas for Greek political philosophy were actually borrowed by the Muslim theologians in their effort to provide a legal basis and put forward as the national justification for the institutions adopted or developed by them according to Iswan Topa. The Prophet of Islam founded a theocratic state, was a system of political and social control based on divine sanctions. It reflected the will of God in its movements and activities. Its desire was to Islamize life in accordance with the law of God as dictates were divine laws to be imposed on human beings for their guidance. The aim of the Prophet was to organize and discipline people in which religious division, social inequality, political din and karmic exploitation should not exist. The law of Islam was the therefore. Nam does not separate religion from politics. In fact, the concept of religion in Islam appeared first. The state was an afterthought. The traditional Islamic law, Harian, does not recognize the independent existence of the state, nor is state regarded as a primary condition of human society. It makes the state completely subservient to the religion of the Prophet. As per the Islamic law, the state is an instrument to serve the religion in the fulfillment of ideals of the Muslim fraternity. Thus, the Islamic theory of state was based on a threefold Torah scripture. Sovereign and one nation. Quran was the scripture, sovereign was the leader, also called Khalifa, the Caliph, political access to the Prophet, and nation was the Millah, the Muslim Brotherhood. According to this theory, the fundamental characteristic of the state was its be in all the three aspects. It considered the establishment of a theocratic based on the Islamic and recommended only one sovereign, the Caliph, to rule over the entire Muslim world. The Caliph was styled as the Amir al-Haider of the four. The office of the Caliph was thus a political and based on minions. The sovereignty resided in there which collected their leader. Dela was under religious compulsion to implement the fourth benefits in subjects. The movement was one which was composed of the Muslims by the Muslims and destined for the happiness and well-being of the Muslims. On the hands of Islam definitely intense the mullahs of the Delhi Salman. Theoretically they were expected to force the intended over their way to the head of the infidel Stodo. They protted to the couch the politically self by the disconto the other amic principle. The pro to the pride mongins from him. However, it was the Degrat D groups within the ruling the local which owned the decision-making process. According to Professor Satish Chandra, was not a theocracy because share as defined by the clergy was Bali Consum of the sultans. The state was formally Islamic in character. It was based on social equality, but on hierarchy. In actual fact, there was hardly any distinction between the lives of Hindus or Muslims. The state in Delhi Sultanate had a written law or constitution. It is important to understand that the concern existed at the beginning of the 13th century, when it was at its formative stage. Different from the concerns of the state in the 14th century when it got coined according to wisdom and political pragmatism of the rulers in the absence solidated. Check your progress. 7. What was the basic belief of the religion of patronage theory? 8. Name the prominent rulers of the slave dynasty who consolidated of Turkish rule in India. 7. Summary. The Gupta Age, AD 320-550 inches, has been a subject of unending debate in academic circles between the nationalist and Marxist historians with diametrically opposite views of this classical period which saw perfection as the keyword in all its activities. Nationalist historians like R.C. Mazumdar, K.K. Datta, H.C. Raychaud who re-exaggerated the achievements of ancient India and coined the term Golden Age for the Gupta period. However, Marxist historians like R.S. Sharma, B.N.S. Yadav and N.J. have derided the period's achievements in art, literature, architecture and metallurgy as it benefited only the upper caste elite and, thus not worthy of the sobriquet of a Golden Age. The use of Greater India with respect to Indian cultural sphere was made popular by a group of Bengali scholars in the 1920s. Swas considered that the dynamics of many Asian cultures, especially those of Southeast Asia, arose from Hindu culture, and the theory of Greater India derived nourishment from Pan-Hinduism. The term Greater India is most commonly used to include the historical and geographic extent of all political units of the Indian subcontinent, and the regions which are culturally related to India or received significant Indian cultural influence. According to D.D. Kasambi, the growth of Indian feudalism is a two-way process, feudalism from above and feudalism from below. However, R.S. Sharma opines that feudalism was the result of state action from above. Sharma's arguments were further strengthened and developed by D. Jha and B.N.S. Yadava. However, the chief characteristics of Indian feudalism, declining trade and urbanization, was seriously questioned by B.D. Chattopadhyaya, Ranade Chakravarti, and John S. Dale. Asiatic mode of production was a concept developed by Karl Marx and D. Friedrich Engels. In the writings of Karl Marx, stages of social history are distinguished not by what human beings produce but by how, or by what means, they produce the material goods for subsistence. Thus, historical periods are founded and differentiated on the basis of the modes of material production. For production, people enter into definite relations with one another. Production occurs within these social relations. Thus, the forces of production shape the relations of production and therefore together define the mode of production. That is the general economic frame or particular manner in which people produce and distribute the means for livelihood. Hence, the successive modes of production are the basic clement of a methodical description of history. More than one mode of production may exist within any particular society at a given point in time. But in all forms of society there is one specific kind of production which assigns rank and influence to all the others. The notion of Asiatic mode of production refers to a specific original mode of Production which is different from the ancient slave mode of production of the feudal mode of production. The growth of Islamization of India can be explained with the help of four basic theories: immigration theory, religion of the sword thesis, religion of patronage theory, and religion of social liberation thesis. Out of these theories, religion of social liberation thesis has so far been most widely acknowledged nation of Islamic in the subcontinent. The advent of Islam in India was an epoch-making event. It exercised a profound effect on the political, religious and socio-cultural life of India. The Turkish invasions marked not only the clash of arms between the Rajputs and the Muslim invaders but also the violent contact between the two strong religious thoughts and streams of cultural forces. From confrontation to cooperation, followed by interaction and synthesis between the two forces, constitute the various stages in the long and checkered socio-cultural history of medieval India. The Turco-Afghan rulers of Delhi brought with them a theocratic concept of state according to which the head of the state was also considered as the Tadivit's position and authority from God. 1.8 Key terms. System where ownership of land is communal and its existence is expressed through the real or imaginary unity of these communities. Groups. There were four groups of people: Brahmins, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Kauri, the flat and yellowish shell of the money Kauri, formerly used as money in parts of Africa and the Indo-Pacific area. Diaral Islam. It is an Islamic term for the Muslim regions of the world. Dialectical. It relates to the logical discussion of ideas and opinions. Historiography. It is the study of the writing of history and of written. Orientalist. This term refers to a person who studies the languages and cultures of East and Southeast Asia. Theocracy. It is a system of government in which priests rule in the name of God or a god. 2.9 Answers to check your progress. 1. Chandragupta I was the first ruler of Gupta dynasty. 2. The term Indianized kingdoms was coined by French archaeologist George Ecords in his book The Indianized States of Southeast Asia. 3. The term Greater India is generally used to include the historical and geographic extent of all political entities of the Indian subcontinent, and the regions which are culturally linked to India or received significant Indian cultural influence. 4. Rise of towns, revival of long-distance trade, escape of peasants and the increase of monetization in economy were regarded as the main factors responsible for the decline of feudalism in India. 5. The concept of Asiatic mode of production was a concept developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. 6. Marx believed that despotism and stagnancy were the basic features of Asiatic mode of production and Shudra Hidari. 7. According to the religion of patronage theory, Indians of the pre-modern period got converted to Islam with the purpose of receiving some religious favor from the ruling class, relief from taxes, promotion in bureaucracy, and so forth. This theory has always been supported by Western-trained secular social scientists that see any religion as a dependent variable of some non-religious agency, especially an assumed desire of social improvement or prestige. 8. Iltutmish and Balban were the prominent rulers of the slave dynasty who made significant contribution towards the consolidation of Turkish rule in India. 4. 10 questions and exercises. Short answer questions. 1. What do you understand by the term Pan-Hinduism? 2. Write a short note on the theory of Greater India. 3. How is the Asiatic mode of production different from the feudal mode of production? 4. Who brought the culture of Islam to India? Long answer questions. 1. Examine the debate for considering the Gupta period as the Golden Age. 2. Discuss the establishment of feudalism in India. 3. Why has the Asiatic mode of production been criticized by the Marxizers? Give reasons for your answer. 4. Explain the debate over Islamiction in India. 5. Explain the synthesis of Indo-Islamic culture in India. 6. Describe the concept of theocracy and the Indian state. 4. 11. Further reading: Stephen P. Den 1962. The Fall and Rise of the Asiatic Mode of Production in London. Routledge and Kegan Paul Hinz, Barty and Hine 1975. Pre-capitalist modes of production. London: Routledge and Kegan Paul Jar, D.N. 1977. Ancient India: An Introductory Outline. New Delhi: Pia PLE's Publishing House. Taylor, SE 1890. The Origin of the Eras. An Account of the Prehistory, Ethnology and Civilization of Europe. New York: Scribner and Welford Hahn. Mark Kenoyer, 1998. Ancient Cities of the Indus Valley Civilization. Oxford. Oxford University Press. Davlika, Madhuka Keshav 2007. The Aryans Myth and Archaeology. New Delhi: Munshiram Manoharlal Publishers. Malik, Kenan 1996. The Meaning of Race. History and Culture Western Society. London: Macmillan. Wheeler Sir Mortimer 1979. The Indus Civilization. 3rd edition. Cambridge University Press. Endnotes: Romula Thapar, 2004. Ancient Indian Social History: Some Interpretations. Orient to Shashi Bhushan Upadhyay, 2016. Historiography in the Modern World: Western and Indian Perspectives. Oxford University Press. p. 301. 3. Richard M. Eaton. The Rise of Islam and the Bengal Frontier. 1204 to 1760. Berkeley University of California Press. 1993. http /13,030,067,999 4L meter 2018. Advanced Study in the History of Medieval India. Volume Medieval Indian Society and Culture. Sterling Publishers. p. Lap. 85. IL meter. 2018. Page 9 10 inches 6. IL meter. 2018. Page 41 2 inches Longman. Page 13 14 inches. Unit 4 Gupta Age.